A tale of werewolves, alphas, and fated destinies, written by Olivia Stone. The forest was dying, which Selene thought was almost poetically fitting for someone like her who had spent the last 8 years of her life wandering through territories that never quite felt like home, passing through packs that never quite wanted her to stay longer than it took to heal their wounded and collect whatever meager payment they were willing to offer before they politely but firmly suggested she move along to the next settlement. The trees around her were skeletal and bare, their branches reaching toward the gray autumn sky like desperate fingers, grasping for warmth that would never come. Their leaves long since fallen to create a carpet of brown and gold that crunched beneath her worn leather boots with every step she took deeper into the neutral wilderness between pack territories. That lawless space where rogues and outcasts made their homes and decent wolves knew better than to linger after dark. Selene Ashwood pulled her thin cloak tighter around her shoulders, though she knew it would do little to ward off the cold that was seeping into her bones with the same relentless persistence that loneliness had seeped into her heart over the years, becoming such a constant companion that she barely noticed it anymore, except in those quiet moments before sleep, when the silence became so oppressive that she found herself talking to the stars, just to hear a voice, even if it was only her own, echoing back from the vast emptiness of the night sky. Her long, silver hair, which had once been the subject of whispered awe and uncomfortable stares in equal measure, hung loose down her back in tangled waves that caught what little light filtered through the dense canopy above, making her look like some ethereal spirit that had wandered too far from the moon and gotten lost among the mortal realm, which was precisely what the wolves of the Silver Pine Pack had called her before Rowan had rejected her in front of everyone who mattered, leaving her with nothing but a broken heart and the overwhelming certainty that she was somehow fundamentally unworthy of the love and belonging that seemed to come so easily to everyone else. She had been walking since dawn, having left the Emberwood Pack's territory at first light after spending 3 exhausting days tending to their beta's daughter, who had contracted a fever that the pack's regular healer couldn't seem to break. And Selene had sat beside the child's bed for 72 hours straight, drawing the sickness out of the little girl's body and into her own until her head pounded and her stomach churned and every muscle in her body screamed for rest. But she had persisted because that was what healers did. That was what her parents had taught her before the plague had taken them both, when she was barely 16 and left her alone in a world that didn't quite know what to do with a silver-haired orphan who looked more like a ghost than a wolf. The beta had paid her with a pouch of dried venison, half a loaf of bread that was already going stale, and a threadbare blanket that had seen better days, along with the now familiar look of gratitude mixed with relief that she would be leaving soon, because as much as they appreciated her healing skills, her presence made people uncomfortable in ways they couldn't quite articulate but felt nonetheless. Something about her pale porcelain skin and storm-gray eyes that seemed to see too much, know too much, feel too much. The settlement she was heading toward, a small village called Willowbend that sat 3 days' walk to the east, was supposed to be more welcoming to wandering healers, or at least that was what the Emberwood Beta had told her when he'd pointed her in the right direction, and wished her safe travels with the kind of forced cheerfulness that really meant, "Please don't come back." And Selene had smiled and nodded and thanked him for his hospitality, even though they both knew it hadn't truly been hospitality so much as a transaction. Her skills traded for just enough resources to keep her moving to the next place where she would once again be needed, but never truly wanted. She was good at healing, exceptionally good if she was being honest with herself, because her parents had been 2 of the most skilled healers in their generation, and they had trained her from the moment she could walk, teaching her which herbs stopped bleeding and which ones eased pain, showing her how to set broken bones and stitch torn flesh. But most importantly, they had helped her understand and nurture her gift. That rare magical ability to sense injuries and illness in living things like a sixth sense that pulsed beneath her skin and guided her hands, that let her draw pain temporarily into her own body to give others relief, though she had learned through hard experience to never take on more than she could handle, because there had been that one time, that one terrible time, when she was 17 and had tried to save a dying elder and had nearly died herself from the transfer of agony. The cry that shattered her melancholic reverie was so unexpected, so sharp and desperate, and utterly out of place in the oppressive silence of the dying forest that Celine stopped dead in her tracks. Her breath catching in her throat and her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs with a force that made her feel dizzy and unsteady on her feet. It was the sound of something small and helpless and in terrible pain, a high-pitched whimper that cut through the air like a knife and went straight to that part of her heart that had never quite hardened, despite 8 years of rejection and loneliness. That stubborn kernel of compassion that kept her moving from pack to pack, offering her services even when she knew she would never be thanked with genuine warmth, never be asked to stay permanently, never be seen as anything more than a useful tool to be employed and then set aside when the immediate need had passed. Celine knew she should keep walking, should mind her own business and stay on the path that would take her to Willowbend before nightfall, because getting involved with unknown situations in neutral territory was a profoundly stupid idea that could get a lone Omega killed or worse, and she had survived this long by being cautious and careful and never taking risks that weren't absolutely necessary. But the cry came again, weaker this time, laced with a kind of desperate terror that spoke of something very young and very hurt, and before her rational mind could overrule her compassionate heart, Celine found her feet carrying her off the main path and into the dense underbrush, following that pitiful sound, through brambles that caught at her cloak and scratched her arms, through fallen logs that she had to climb over with her healing satchel bouncing against her hip, through a stand of ancient oaks whose twisted roots seemed determined to trip her and send her sprawling face first into the carpet of dead leaves. Her healing sense activated before she even saw the source of the crying. That magical awareness flaring to life like a flame suddenly fed oxygen, and the sensation of pain that washed over her was so intense that she actually gasped and stumbled, catching herself against a tree trunk while her mind tried to process the information her gift was feeding her in overwhelming waves. Something was badly hurt, seriously injured in ways that would require immediate intervention, or the poor creature wouldn't last the hour. And that knowledge propelled Celine forward with renewed urgency, her exhaustion from 3 days of intensive healing forgotten in the face of this new crisis. Because if there was one thing she couldn't do, one line she absolutely refused to cross no matter how many times the world had hurt her in return, it was walking away from a creature in pain when she had the power to help. She burst through a thicket of thorny bushes and found herself in a small clearing where the autumn sunlight managed to penetrate the forest canopy in weak golden shafts that illuminated a scene that made Celine's blood run cold and her healer's instincts scream in alarm. There, on the forest floor, caught in what looked like a hunter's trap, was a wolf pup, and not just any wolf pup, but one with the most unusual and striking appearance she had ever seen, with fur as pure and silver as moonlight on fresh snow, and eyes that were the color of ice and winter sky, pale blue and achingly beautiful, even as they were clouded with pain and terror. The trap itself was a cruel thing of rusted iron with mechanical jaws that had clamped down on the pup's front left paw with merciless force. And Celine could see the dark stain of blood spreading across the silver fur. Could see the unnatural angle of small bones that suggested fractures in addition to the lacerations. Could see the way the tiny creature was, shivering violently from a combination of shock, blood loss, and the early stages of hypothermia that would kill him just as surely as his wounds if she didn't act fast. The pup's eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that seemed far too aware, far too intelligent for something that should have been operating purely on instinct and fear. And in that moment of connection, Celine felt something shift in her chest. Something that had nothing to do with her healing sense and everything to do with a pull she couldn't name. A recognition that whispered through her soul in a voice too quiet to hear, but too persistent to ignore. She took a step forward, her hands already reaching for the medical supplies in her satchel, and the pup tried to snap at her with tiny teeth that could barely break skin. A defensive gesture born of terror rather than true aggression. And Celine understood, because hadn't she been just as defensive, just as afraid of being hurt again, after Rowan's rejection had taught her that trust was a luxury people like her couldn't afford? Shh, it's okay. I'm going to help you. Celine heard herself saying in a voice that was surprisingly steady, despite the way her hands were shaking. And she knelt down in the dirt and leaves beside this injured creature, who should have been with his pack, with his mother, with anyone except alone and dying in a trap that had probably been meant for larger game. And she forced herself to assess the situation with the clinical detachment her parents had taught her, even as her heart was breaking for this small, helpless thing that was looking at her with those impossibly blue eyes that held depths of understanding no animal should possess. The trap was old but still functional, its mechanism locked tight around delicate bones that were definitely broken, the metal teeth having punched through fur and skin to tear into the muscle and tissue beneath. And she could see from the dried blood on the pup's other legs that he had been struggling for quite some time, probably hours if not longer, fighting against the trap with diminishing strength until exhaustion and pain had finally forced him to simply lie there and wait for either rescue or death, whichever came first. Celine's mind raced through her options while her healing sense continued to feed her information about internal damage, about the infection that was already beginning to set in despite the short time frame, about the dangerous drop in core body temperature that meant she was running out of time to make a decision. She could try to open the trap here, but the mechanism was rusted and would require both hands and significant force, which meant the pup would be loose and able to run away before she could treat his wounds, and given the extent of the injuries, he wouldn't make it more than a few dozen yards before collapsing and bleeding out in some hidden corner of the forest where she'd never find him. Alternatively, she could try to sedate him, somehow, but she didn't carry any sedative strong enough to work on a wolf, even a young one. And besides, in his weakened state, any kind of drug might push him over the edge into shock or cardiac arrest, and that was assuming she could even get him to swallow anything, given how defensive and frightened he clearly was right now. The decision, when it came, was both instantaneous and inevitable, because Celine had never been particularly good at choosing self-preservation over compassion, had never mastered the art of walking away from suffering, even when it would have been the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do, the logical thing that any sensible lone omega would choose when faced with an unknown situation in dangerous territory. She pulled her leather belt from around her waist, folded it several times to create a thick pad, and offered it to the pup, letting him bite down on it and get a good grip before she began the painful process of trying to pry open the trap's jaws. And she talked to him the entire time in that same steady, soothing voice, telling him it would be okay, that she wouldn't leave him, that he just needed to hold on a little longer and she would fix this. She would make the pain stop, she promised, even though promises were dangerous things for someone like her to make. Someone who had learned that the world didn't keep its promises to silver-haired wanderers who didn't quite fit anywhere. The trap resisted her efforts with stubborn determination, the rust and age having locked the mechanism in place, and Celine felt tears of frustration beginning to build behind her eyes as she struggled and strained, her muscles screaming in protest and her fingers going numb from the cold metal, while the pup whimpered around the leather belt and his eyes never left her face, watching her with that same unsettling awareness that made her wonder if perhaps there was more to this situation than she understood, more to this creature than met the eye. But she pushed those thoughts aside, because right now, all that mattered was getting him free before it was too late, before she became just another person who had failed to save something precious and innocent when it mattered most. The trap finally gave way with a metallic shriek that echoed through the forest like the death cry of some ancient creature, and Celine felt the resistance suddenly disappear as the rusted jaws sprang open with such force that she nearly fell backward into the dirt. But she managed to catch herself at the last second, even as her hands were screaming in protest from the effort of forcing open a mechanism that had probably been sitting in these woods for years, slowly corroding and waiting for some unfortunate animal to stumble into its merciless embrace. The moment the pressure released, the wolf pup let out a yelp of pure agony that went straight through Celine's heart like a physical blade, because the removal of the trap's compression meant that blood was now flowing freely from the torn vessels and shredded tissue, painting his beautiful silver fur a deep and terrible crimson that looked wrong, fundamentally wrong, like someone had taken a pristine canvas and splattered it with violence. The pup immediately tried to scramble away from her despite the fact that his injured leg was essentially useless, dragging himself across the forest floor with his 3 good legs in a desperate bid for escape that was both heartbreaking and completely understandable. Because why would he trust her when the world had clearly taught him that danger lurked everywhere, and help often came with strings attached that were worse than the original problem? Celine moved faster than she would have thought possible given her exhaustion, throwing herself forward to catch the small creature before he could disappear into the underbrush where she would lose him forever. And she felt his tiny teeth sink into her left hand with surprising force, piercing through her skin and drawing blood that mixed with his own on her palm. But she didn't let go, couldn't let go, because releasing him now would be tantamount to murder, a passive killing that would haunt her for whatever remained of her lonely existence. I know it hurts. I know you're scared, but please, please stop fighting me, Celine begged through tears that were now flowing freely down her cheeks, her voice breaking with the kind of raw emotion she usually kept carefully locked away, behind walls built from 8 years of rejection and disappointment. And perhaps it was the desperation in her tone, or perhaps it was simple exhaustion. But the pup suddenly went still in her arms, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths that spoke of shock and trauma, while those extraordinary blue eyes locked onto hers with an expression that seemed almost human in its complexity, carrying layers of pain and fear and something else, something that looked disturbingly like recognition, like he knew her somehow, which was impossible because she had never seen this creature before in her life. And yet the sensation of familiarity was undeniable. She wrapped him carefully in her cloak, despite the fact that it was the only real protection she had against the rapidly dropping temperature, bundling the shivering pup against her chest and holding him with one arm while she used her free hand to dig through her healing satchel for the supplies she would need, and her mind was already cataloging everything she could feel through her gift, every broken bone and torn vessel and damaged nerve ending, the information flowing through her awareness like a river of agony that she had to consciously wall off or risk being completely overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of his suffering. The paw was definitely fractured in multiple places, the delicate bones crushed by the trap's mechanical bite, and the lacerations went deep enough that she could see glimpses of white bone through the torn flesh, which meant she needed to clean the wounds immediately before infection could take hold and spread through his small body like wildfire, turning what was currently a manageable crisis into a death sentence. Celine half ran, half stumbled back through the forest toward the place where she had been planning to make camp for the night. A small clearing near a creek that she had noted earlier in her travels, and every step sent jolts of protest through her exhausted muscles, while the pup's blood soaked through her shirt and made her skin sticky and warm, in contrast to the cold autumn air that was cutting through her, now that she had sacrificed her cloak to keep him from going deeper into hypothermia. Her healing sense was screaming at her with increasing urgency, warning her that the pup's condition was deteriorating faster than she had initially assessed, that there was internal damage she hadn't accounted for, bruising and possible bleeding in places she couldn't see, legacy injuries from however long he had been struggling against the trap before she found him, and the realization that she might not be able to save him despite her best efforts filled her with a panic so profound that it made her feel physically ill. By the time she reached the clearing, Celine's lungs were burning and her vision was starting to blur at the edges from the combination of physical exhaustion and emotional distress. But she forced herself to focus, to push past the limitations of her body and access that deeper reserve of strength that all healers learn to tap into when lives hung in the balance. That place where determination mattered more than stamina, and will mattered more than skill. She laid the pup down as gently as possible on a relatively flat patch of ground near where she had already gathered kindling for a fire, and she worked with frantic efficiency to get flames going, because he needed warmth almost as desperately as he needed medical attention, his small body temperature having dropped to dangerous levels that would slow his healing and make him more susceptible to shock. Once the fire was crackling with sufficient heat, Celine turned her full attention to the injured paw, unwrapping it from the cloak and forcing herself to look at the damage with clinical detachment, even though every healer's instinct she possessed was screaming at her to just fix it, to use her gift to draw away the pain and accelerate the healing. But she knew from hard experience that she needed to address the physical trauma first, or risk her magical intervention being completely wasted on injuries that would simply reopen the moment she stopped channeling energy into them. She poured water from her canteen over the wounds, washing away the blood and dirt and forest debris that had gotten ground into the torn tissue, and the pup whimpered but didn't try to pull away, which worried her more than if he had been fighting, because that level of passive acceptance usually meant a creature had given up, had decided that death was inevitable and resistance was pointless, and she absolutely refused to let that be the outcome of this situation. "Stay with me. Please stay with me. You're going to be fine. I promise you're going to be fine." Celine found herself chanting like a mantra as she worked, her hands moving with practiced precision to clean and assess and begin the painstaking process of setting bones that were fractured in configurations she had never encountered before, because wolf pups weren't supposed to step in. Hunters' traps, meant for deer or bears, weren't supposed to be alone and vulnerable in neutral territory where no pack would come looking for them. And the mystery of how this beautiful silver creature had ended up in such terrible circumstances nagged at the back of her mind, even as she focused on the immediate crisis. She had to break and reset several of the smaller bones that had healed incorrectly during his time in the trap. And each time she heard the tiny crack of bone being realigned, she felt her stomach turn and her heart break a little more. But she continued because there was no alternative, because doing nothing would leave him permanently crippled and in chronic pain, and that was unacceptable. The stitching took nearly an hour, her fingers cramping from the delicate work of closing lacerations that had irregular edges and damaged tissue that kept trying to bleed despite her best efforts at cauterization and compression. And by the time she finally tied off the last suture, the sun had fully set, and the only light came from her small campfire that cast dancing shadows across the clearing and made the pup's silver fur seem to glow with an otherworldly luminescence that reminded her uncomfortably of all the whispered stories about moon-blessed wolves and ancient prophecies that her grandmother used to tell before the old woman had passed away when Celine was barely 10 years old. She created a splint from straight branches and strips of cloth torn from her spare shirt, wrapping the injured paw with enough support to keep the bones stable while they healed, but not so tight that it would cut off circulation. And she checked and rechecked her work with obsessive attention to detail, because mistakes at this stage could mean the difference between full recovery and permanent disability. Only when the physical trauma had been addressed as thoroughly as her supplies and expertise allowed did Celine finally permit herself to tap into her healing gift, that magical well of energy that lived somewhere in the core of her being and connected her to all living things. And she placed both hands gently on either side of the splinted paw and opened herself to the flow of power that immediately began moving from her body into his, seeking out the damaged tissues and accelerated cellular repair, knitting together torn vessels and stimulating bone growth and fighting off the infection that had already begun to establish itself in the deeper wounds. The sensation was both familiar and overwhelming, like diving into a river and feeling the current pull you along whether you were ready or not. And Celine felt the pup's pain flowing into her own nerves, burning through her awareness with white-hot intensity that made her gasp and bite down on her lip hard enough to draw blood. But she didn't stop, couldn't stop, because this was what healers did. They took the suffering of others into themselves so that the wounded could have a chance to recover without the burden of agony slowing their natural processes. Time became meaningless as she worked, the world narrowing down to just the two of them connected by her gift and his need. And Celine poured everything she had into healing this small creature who had somehow become the most important thing in her universe, despite the fact that she didn't even know where he had come from, or why he had been alone, or whether anyone would come looking for him. And as she channeled more and more energy into accelerating his recovery, she felt her own strength beginning to wane, her body's resources being depleted faster than was probably wise. But she had never been particularly good at self-preservation when someone else's life was at stake. She could feel him getting stronger under her hands, could sense his body temperature rising back toward normal ranges, and his heartbeat becoming more steady and regular. And that knowledge gave her the motivation to push just a little harder, to dig just a little deeper into her reserves, to give just a little more, even though warning bells were starting to go off in the back of her mind about the dangers of overextending herself so soon after spending 3 days healing the beta's daughter. When Celine finally pulled her hands away, breaking the connection and letting her gift settle back into its dormant state, she was so exhausted that she literally couldn't feel her arms below the elbows, and her vision was swimming with spots of darkness that threatened to expand and consume her entirely, and she swayed where she knelt, nearly pitching forward into the fire before she caught herself and managed to shift into a sitting position that wouldn't result in her accidentally immolating herself while unconscious. The pup was sleeping now, his breathing deep, and even in a way that suggested genuine rest rather than shock-induced unconsciousness. And even in the flickering firelight, she could see that the swelling in his paw had already decreased noticeably, and the color was returning to healthy pink, rather than the concerning mottled purple it had been when she first freed him from the trap. "You're going to be okay?" Celine whispered to the sleeping pup, reaching out with one trembling hand to gently stroke the soft fur on his head. And she felt an unexpected surge of emotion well up in her chest. A fierce protective instinct that seemed completely disproportionate to the few hours she had known this creature. But somehow in saving his life, she had formed a connection that felt more real and more important than any relationship she had maintained with her own species in the 8 years since Rowan had rejected her and sent her out into a world that had no place for silver-haired wanderers who didn't quite fit the mold. She tried to stand, intending to gather more firewood and check her supplies and do all the practical things that needed doing to ensure they both survived the night. But her legs refused to cooperate, buckling underneath her and sending her sprawling onto the ground beside the fire. And she realized with a detached sort of horror that she had pushed herself too far, had given too much, had depleted her resources to the point where her own body was starting to shut down in protest. The pup stirred at her sudden collapse, his eyes opening to regard her with that same unsettling awareness. And Selena wanted to reassure him that she was fine, that this was just temporary exhaustion and nothing to worry about. But she couldn't seem to make her mouth form the words, couldn't seem to do anything except lie there in the dirt and watch as those extraordinary blue eyes moved from her face to scan the clearing as though looking for threats. And she wondered, with the kind of irrational concern that comes with extreme fatigue, whether he would be able to defend himself if predators came during the night. Whether she had saved him from the trap only to leave him vulnerable to rogues or bears or any of the other dangers that lurked in neutral territory after dark. She tried to reach for her satchel, thinking maybe she had some herbs that could give her a temporary boost of energy. But her arm felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, and moving even a few inches seemed like an insurmountable challenge, and the edges of her vision were going dark in a way that suggested consciousness was no longer optional, but rather a privilege that was about to be revoked, whether she consented or not. The last thing Celine saw before exhaustion finally dragged her under was the wolf pup struggling to his feet despite his injured paw, limping over to where she lay sprawled in an undignified heap. And then she felt the warm weight of his small body pressing against her side, felt him curl protectively around her torso as though he were the guardian and she were the one in need of protection. And she wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. This tiny creature she had just saved now trying to keep her safe. But the darkness was rising too fast and pulling her down too deep. And her last conscious thought was a fervent prayer to the moon goddess that they would both still be alive come morning. That her gamble of using so much of her gift so soon after her previous healing session wouldn't prove to be a fatal mistake. And that if she died here in this clearing with a strange wolf pup she had known for mere hours, at least she would die knowing she had done everything possible to save an innocent life, which was more purpose than she had felt in 8 years of aimless wandering. The forest grew darker and colder as night deepened around them, and the fire burned lower, its flames casting increasingly faint light across the clearing where a silver-haired healer and a silver-furred pup lay together in the vulnerable sleep of the utterly exhausted, neither of them aware that their chance meeting would set in motion events that would shake the foundations of every pack in the Northern Territories, that the small creature she had saved was not at all what he appeared to be, and that the mate bond already beginning to form between them would either be her salvation or her ultimate destruction, depending entirely on whether she could survive long enough to discover the truth about the helpless wolf pup who watched over her with ancient eyes that held secrets no animal should possess. Celine woke to warmth and the peculiar sensation of being watched, which under normal circumstances would have sent her scrambling for the small knife she kept hidden in her boot. But there was something about the quality of the attention focused on her that felt protective rather than predatory, concerned rather than threatening. And when she finally managed to force her heavy eyelids open against the morning light that was filtering through the forest canopy in soft golden streams, the first thing she saw was a pair of ice-blue eyes studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat and her heart stutter in her chest. The wolf pup was still curled against her side, where he had apparently spent the entire night keeping watch over her, while she recovered from the dangerous depletion of her healing reserves, and the splinted paw that had been so horrifically damaged just hours before was already showing signs of remarkable improvement. The swelling reduced to almost nothing and the color healthy and pink where she could see it beneath the bandages, which meant her healing gift had worked even better than she had dared to hope, accelerating his natural recovery to a pace that would have seemed miraculous to anyone who didn't understand the true extent of what a skilled healer could accomplish when properly motivated. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted the decision, as every muscle in her body screamed in protest, reminding her in exquisitely painful detail that she had pushed herself far beyond reasonable limits, and her physical form was going to make her pay for that transgression with compound interest. But she forced herself upright anyway, because lying helpless in neutral territory was a profoundly stupid thing to do, regardless of how much her body wanted to simply surrender to the exhaustion that still clung to her bones like frost on winter grass. The pup made a soft sound that might have been concern or disapproval. And when Celine looked down at him, she was startled to see that he was attempting to stand as well, putting weight gingerly on his injured paw in a way that suggested the pain had diminished significantly overnight, which was excellent news from a medical perspective, but also somewhat alarming because it meant he might be strong enough to run away before she could figure out where he belonged, or how to reunite him with whatever pack had lost him to the cruel mechanism of that hunter's trap. "Easy there, little one. You need to rest that paw even if it feels better, because the bones are still knitting, and too much movement could undo all the work we did last night," Celine said in a voice that came out rougher and more ragged than she intended, her throat dry from dehydration and the lingering effects of channeling so much magical energy through her system, and she reached for her canteen, only to discover that she had used most of her water supply cleaning his wounds, which meant she would need to make her way down to the creek she had heard babbling somewhere nearby and refill her containers before she could continue her journey toward Willow Bend, assuming she was still capable of traveling after the beating her body had taken. The pup watched her drink the last few swallows of water with those unsettlingly intelligent eyes, and Celine found herself talking to him the way she always talked to injured animals, partly because it seemed to soothe them, and partly because, after 8 years of wandering alone, she had developed the habit of narrating her actions to whatever creatures would listen, filling the oppressive silence with the sound of her own voice, just to maintain some tenuous connection to the concept of communication and community. "I need to check your bandages and make sure there's no infection setting in, and then we need to figure out what to do about you. Because, as much as I've enjoyed our time together, you can't exactly come with me to Willow Bend, and I can't stay here indefinitely, because I have exactly half a loaf of stale bread and maybe 2 days' worth of dried meat left to my name, which isn't going to sustain both of us for very long." Celine heard herself explaining as she carefully unwrapped the splint to examine her handiwork in the clearer light of morning, and what she found made her pause and stare in confusion, because the healing was progressing at a rate that shouldn't have been possible, even with her gift's intervention. The torn tissue already beginning to knit together with the kind of accelerated regeneration she had only ever seen in exceptionally powerful wolves. Usually alphas, or those with ancient bloodlines that carried genetic advantages ordinary pack members couldn't access. She ran her fingers gently over the healing wounds, using her gift to sense what was happening beneath the surface, and the feedback she received made her frown in concentration, because there was something strange about this pup's energy signature. Something that felt simultaneously young and incredibly old, vulnerable, and overwhelmingly powerful, like he was somehow existing in two states at once, in a way that defied everything she understood about wolf physiology and magical mechanics. The pup made another soft sound and tilted his head in a gesture that seemed almost questioning, and Celine found herself meeting those blue eyes again. Really looking at them for the first time since the crisis had passed, and she had the mental bandwidth to observe rather than simply react, and what she saw there made her pulse quicken with a mixture of wonder and trepidation, because there was definitely something more than animal awareness gazing back at her from behind that innocent canine face. "Who are you?" she whispered, the question slipping out before she could stop it, and she felt foolish immediately because obviously he couldn't answer. He was a wolf pup who probably understood nothing beyond basic survival instincts and pain responses, except that he was nodding, actually nodding his small head, in what could only be interpreted as acknowledgement or perhaps agreement. And Celine felt the bottom drop out of her stomach as the implications of that gesture settled over her like a suffocating blanket. Before she could process what she was seeing, before she could begin to formulate theories about curses or transformation magic or any of the other possibilities that might explain a wolf pup with human-level comprehension, the air around them began to shimmer with energy that made Celine's healing sense flare to life in alarm. Magic recognizing magic in a way that was unmistakable and undeniable, and she watched in stunned silence as the pup's body started to change, bones lengthening and reshaping with audible cracks that made her wince in sympathetic pain, silver fur receding to reveal pale skin that seemed to glow with its own internal luminescence, and within the span of perhaps 30 seconds, that felt like an eternity, there was no longer a small, injured wolf lying beside her campfire, but instead a man, tall and powerfully built, despite the obvious signs of recent trauma, with silver hair that fell past his shoulders in waves that perfectly matched her own, and those same extraordinary ice-blue eyes that had watched over her throughout the night. Celine scrambled backward with a startled cry that probably wasn't dignified, but was certainly justified given the circumstances, her exhausted body protesting the sudden movement, even as her mind struggled to catch up with what she had just witnessed. And she found herself pressed against a tree trunk, with her heart hammering so violently that she thought it might actually break through her ribcage, staring at this stranger who was somehow familiar. This man who had been a pup just moments before and trying desperately to make sense of a situation that had gone from unusual to impossible in the space of a single transformation. The man made no move toward her, seeming to understand that she needed space to process, and he remained kneeling where the pup had been, seemingly unconcerned about his complete lack of clothing or the cold morning air that was raising goosebumps on his exposed skin. And when he finally spoke, his voice was deep and rich and carried the kind of inherent authority that made something in Celine's wolf instinctively want to submit, even though she had spent 8 years teaching herself to bow to no one. "My name is Caspian Stormhaven, and I am the Alpha King of the Northern Territories. And before you panic any further, please know that you saved my life last night in ways you cannot possibly comprehend. And I owe you a debt that can never be fully repaid, but which I intend to spend the rest of my existence attempting to honor," he said, and each word fell into the space between them like stones dropping into still water, creating ripples of implication that spread outward to touch every assumption Celine had made about her life and her place in it, and what the universe expected from someone like her. She opened her mouth to respond, to ask the 1,000 questions that were suddenly crowding her mind, demanding answers. But no sound emerged, because her brain had apparently decided that speech was too complex a function to manage, while simultaneously trying to reconcile the fact that she had just spent the night cuddling with the most powerful wolf in the known world, that she had sung lullabies to royalty, that she had seen the Alpha King in his most vulnerable state, and he had seen her in hers. And the intimacy of that exchange felt both terrifying and impossibly precious in ways she couldn't begin to articulate. Caspian seemed to understand her inability to speak, and he continued in that same measured tone that suggested he was choosing his words with extreme care, explaining about the spell he had voluntarily subjected himself to, the ancient magic that would transform him into a vulnerable pup and scatter him into neutral territory where he would be forced to rely on the compassion of strangers. The test he had designed to find a mate who would help a helpless creature expecting nothing in return, who would sacrifice their own comfort and safety for someone they believed to be nobody important. Because those were the qualities he needed in a Luna. Genuine compassion that wasn't performative or transactional, but instead flowed from a heart that couldn't help but give, even when the world had given it nothing but pain and rejection in return. The spell was supposed to last 7 days, but it can be broken early if the conditions are met. If someone provides genuine aid without expectation of reward, and you, Celine Ashwood, you broke that spell with your kindness, with your refusal to leave me suffering in that trap, even though the smart thing, the safe thing, would have been to keep walking, Caspian said, and Celine finally found her voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper threaded through, with confusion and disbelief and something that might have been anger at the manipulation of it all. You were testing me. You let me exhaust myself healing you. You listened to me pour out my pathetic history and my loneliness and every insecurity I've spent 8 years trying to bury, and it was all just a test to see if I was worthy of being your Luna? The words came out sharper than she intended, edged with the kind of hurt that comes from feeling exposed and vulnerable and judged when you thought you were simply being yourself. And she saw something flicker across Caspian's face that might have been pain or regret, or possibly both. And he shook his head slowly, his silver hair catching the morning light in a way that created a halo effect that would have been beautiful if Celine hadn't been so busy feeling betrayed and confused and overwhelmingly out of her depth. It started as a test, yes, but the danger was real, the pain was real. Without you, I would have died in that trap because I miscalculated how vulnerable the spell would make me, how much damage I could sustain before my body gave up entirely. And you didn't just pass some arbitrary evaluation, Celine. You saved my actual life, and in doing so you showed me exactly who you are at your core, someone who will sacrifice everything for a stranger, someone whose compassion is so genuine that it overrides every survival instinct, every reasonable fear, every painful lesson the world has taught about the cost of caring too much. Caspian replied, and he was looking at her with an expression that was so raw and unguarded that it made Celine's breath catch, because she recognized that look, had seen it in her own reflection during those rare moments when she let herself acknowledge how desperately lonely she was, how much she yearned for connection, even as she convinced herself that solitude was safer than risking another rejection. And yes, I heard everything you said, every story about your parents and your gift, and the man who rejected you, and none of it made me think less of you. None of it made me question whether you were enough. Instead, every word just convinced me more thoroughly that you are exactly what I've been searching for. What my pack needs, what I need, because you are strong in ways that have nothing to do with physical power or political acumen. You are strong in your heart, in your unwavering commitment to healing and helping, even when it costs you everything. And that is the rarest and most valuable kind of strength that exists. Celine felt tears beginning to blur her vision as she processed his words, fighting against the part of her that wanted desperately to believe him, that wanted to accept that maybe, just maybe, her differences weren't flaws, but instead were exactly what made her valuable. While another part, the part that had been shaped by 8 years of wandering and rejection, whispered that this was too good to be true, that men like him didn't choose women like her, that eventually he would realize his mistake, and she would be right back where she started, except with a broken heart that would make Rowan's rejection feel like a paper cut compared to the mortal wound of losing a mate bond before it had even fully formed. "I can feel it," she admitted quietly, one hand moving unconsciously to press against her chest, where something warm and golden was pulsing in time with her heartbeat. Something that had appeared during the night while she slept, and that she now recognized as the mate bond beginning to establish itself between them. That magical connection that the moon goddess forged between wolves who were meant to walk through life together. And the sensation was simultaneously wonderful and terrifying, because accepting it meant accepting him, accepting a future she had never dared to imagine for herself, accepting that maybe she had been wrong about being fundamentally unworthy of love and belonging. Caspian's expression softened into something that looked like hope mixed with relief, and he remained kneeling in the dirt despite his obvious discomfort, maintaining that non-threatening posture, because he understood that she needed to make this choice without feeling pressured or overwhelmed by his presence or his position. And Celine realized with a jolt that this was probably the first time in years that anyone had given her the space to make her own decision without trying to influence or manipulate the outcome. That he was offering her genuine choice in a way that Rowan never had, in a way that no one ever had, really. "I'm scared," Selene whispered, the admission feeling like both a confession and a plea. And Caspian nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers, holding her gaze with an intensity that made her feel seen in ways that were uncomfortable and exhilarating in equal measure. "So am I," he replied simply. And there was something about that acknowledgement, about the way he wasn't trying to pretend he had all the answers, or that this would be easy, or that love conquered all without requiring work and trust, and the constant choice to keep showing up even when things got difficult, that finally broke through Celine's defenses and allowed her to really look at him, not as the alpha king or as some impossible fantasy, but as a person who was just as scared and vulnerable and hopeful as she was. Someone who had voluntarily subjected himself to a potentially fatal spell, because he was so desperate to find genuine connection that he was willing to risk everything for it. They stayed like that for a long moment, the silver-haired healer and the silver-haired king, separated by a few feet of forest floor and 8 years of accumulated fear and pain, but connected by something neither of them fully understood yet, but both recognized as important, as potentially life-changing, as the kind of beginning that could either save them both or destroy them completely, depending entirely on whether Celine was brave enough to take the leap. "I don't know how to be a Luna. I don't know how to be a queen. I barely know how to be a person most days, because I've spent so long just surviving that I forgot how to actually live," Celine said, the words tumbling out in a rush like she needed to get them all out before courage failed her. And Caspian smiled. really smiled for the first time since transforming, and the expression transformed his entire face from formally handsome to genuinely beautiful in a way that made Celine's heart skip several beats in rapid succession. "Then we'll learn together," he said simply, "because I don't need you to be perfect or polished or politically savvy. I just need you to be exactly who you are, the woman who saved a dying wolf pup without hesitation, the woman who sang lullabies to a stranger and shared her last blanket and pushed herself to dangerous limits because she couldn't bear to let another creature suffer. That is the woman I choose. That is the woman my pack needs. That is the woman the moon goddess marked with silver hair to match mine because we were always meant to find each other. Even if it took 8 years of wandering and a hunter's trap and a spell that almost killed me to make it happen." And standing there in that clearing with the morning sun painting everything gold and silver, with the evidence of her night's work visible in the healing wounds on his wrist, where the splint still remained, with the mate bond humming between them like a living thing that demanded acknowledgement, Celine Ashwood made the choice that would change everything, taking those few steps forward that closed the physical distance between them and kneeling down so they were eye to eye, equals despite their vastly different circumstances. And when she reached out to take his hand in hers, threading their fingers together in a gesture that was simultaneously innocent and profoundly intimate, she felt the mate bond flare bright enough that it lit up her entire chest with warmth that chased away 8 years of accumulated cold and loneliness. "Okay," she whispered, the single word containing multitudes of meaning, acceptance, and hope, and fear, and determination all wrapped up together. "Okay, I choose you too. I choose this. I choose to stop running and start living. I choose to believe that maybe the moon goddess knew what she was doing when she sent you into my path disguised as something helpless that needed saving, because maybe we both needed saving. Maybe we both needed someone who would see us for who we really are beneath all the titles and expectations and accumulated pain. And maybe, just maybe, together, we can build something better than either of us could have imagined alone." And in that moment, in that clearing where a silver-haired wanderer had saved a silver-haired king, and in doing so had saved herself, the real story began. Not the story of the test or the spell or the convenient prophecy, but the story of two souls who chose each other despite every reason to protect themselves, who decided that love was worth the risk, even when the world had taught them both that caring too much only led to pain, who understood that true strength wasn't about never being vulnerable, but about being brave enough to be vulnerable with the right person. And as Caspian pulled Celine into his arms and held her, while she finally let herself cry for everything she had lost, and everything she was afraid to hope for, and everything that might be possible if she just had the courage to reach for it, the forest around them seemed to hold its breath. The very trees and stones and streams bearing witness to the moment when two wandering souls finally found their way home. If you enjoyed Celine and Caspian's story, this tale of a silver-haired healer who saved a helpless wolf pup without knowing he was the alpha king searching for a mate who would choose compassion over caution and love over fear, then please subscribe to this channel where I share stories about werewolves and fated mates and the kind of love that transforms lives, because there are so many more tales waiting to be told about strong omegas and powerful alphas, and the bonds that defy expectations and change destinies. Leave a comment below telling me what you thought about Celine's journey from rejection to belonging, about whether you saw the twist coming, or if Caspian's revelation surprised you, about which moment resonated most deeply with your own experiences of feeling like you don't quite fit anywhere until you find the person or place or purpose that makes everything suddenly make sense. And let me know what kind of werewolf romance you'd like to see next, because your support and engagement truly means everything and helps me continue creating these stories that explore the beautiful and complicated and sometimes painful process of finding where and with whom we truly belong. Thank you for reading, for investing your time and emotion in these characters who have become so real to me, and I promise there are many more stories coming that will take you on similar journeys of self-discovery and unexpected love, and the courage it takes to choose happiness even when every past experience has taught you that hoping for more only leads to heartbreak. So hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload, and I'll see you in the next story where new characters will discover what Selene and Caspian learned in that forest clearing, that sometimes the most broken among us are the ones who have the most to give, and that the moon goddess never makes mistakes. She simply takes her time ensuring that when souls finally meet, they're both ready to recognize what they've found.